2007 was incredibly important for many different reasons. The regular summer melt carried on for longer than anyone expected, and the amount of ice left was a record. Not just the Arctic map changing, what does it mean for politics, what does it mean for climate, what does it mean for the struggle for resources?
The New North, which is a term I've coined to refer to those lands and oceans lying north of 45 degrees north latitude and controlled by 8 countries in particular that I've coined the NORCs. These are countries that have significant holdings in the high latitudes. They would be the United States, Canada, Greenland, which is part of Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. I argue that these lands and these seas are positioned for very significant transformations in the coming years, one that will make this place, this region, one of rising strategic value to the world and a place of increasing notice and importance to the world. And the arguments are not based solely on climate change. They are instead based on these 4 global forces that are operating worldwide. Population demographics, so these are fertility statistics, aging structures of populations, migration from rural to urban areas, natural resource demand, what the projected demand is, for what resources, where are the deposits known and likely of these resources, what is their geography, what is their accessibility. Globalization, a big word meaning many things. I here refer it to basically a collection of processes that are making the world more integrated, particularly with regard to economic activity. NAFTA is very important, for example, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And then finally, climate change. And I mostly focus on the steady, predictable sort associated with greenhouse forcing. I'm a scientist by training. And like in this project really is a thought experiment of what our world might look like in 40 years' time should these current trends continue operating as they are today without intervention by us. So it's not so much a prediction of the future as a projection of where our current behaviors are going. Like any experiment, this thought experiment needs to be bound by ground rules and assumptions. Very briefly, they are, number 1, no silver bullets, meaning incremental, foreseeable changes in technology. So things on the horizon like cellulosic biofuels, those are allowed and discussed. Something like cold nuclear fusion, it could happen, who knows, but I don't spend time, dedicate time talking about the possibility. Same thing, the second rule, no World War III. The first 2 world wars of the 20th century remade the map. They shredded international agreements. They redrew political boundaries. Not to say such a thing can and won't happen in the next 40 years, only that I don't entertain that possibility here. The third one, no hidden genies, referring to a low probability but very high impact event, a meteorite impact, a decades-long depression, a collapse of globalization. And finally, the models are good enough. By this, I'm referring to computer models, for example, of future population, of future climate change. An example of one of these models is the United Nations population model, which suggests population continues to rise. There are good signs of a cusping. As fertility drops, rates drop around the world. Another big demographic projection, the world is becoming more elderly. The age structure of the human race is becoming more elderly. The single biggest demographic transition, one that has enormous implications for humanity's footprint on the globe, is not, I argue, the number of people on Earth, but the type of lifestyle that we live. This is a photograph of Shanghai. For the first time in human history, the majority of people are living in cities. We no longer have the means to feed ourselves, clothe ourselves. We rely on others to provide those most fundamental of life services for us. And increasingly, those services are provided by multinational companies like these. Trader Joe's is a very popular food chain. It's very favored by liberal progressives and yuppies. It favors a lot of organic food. And the difference between these 2 companies is largely a matter of business practices. But as a business model, they're identical. Both of these are multinational corporations that are reaching around the world to cut out the middle person and get resources to the urban consumer through global supply chains as leanly and meanly and efficiently and profitably as can be. Not only are resources being brought into the urban consumer, but necessary raw goods like energy and water and metals are increasingly pursued by this model. And we're going to have 9 more megacities, cities of 10 million or more, by the year 2025, based on the UN projections. All of this new urban growth is happening. It's not happening in Europe. It's not happening in North America. The electrification required to fulfill the needs of this new urban consumer are enormous. And just focusing on electricity, this is more or less the present day basket of energy sources to produce electricity that's required. It's mostly coal, mostly natural gas. The truth is, what will it look like by 2050? Based on projections from the IEA, we find that even with aggressive development of wind and solar power, realistically, there's no way we can completely wean ourselves off of fossil fuels by 2050. If we just extend current behaviors, we're looking at a heavy predominance on coal by mid-century, requiring a near tripling of coal supply, and still a heavy predominance of natural gas, requiring a near doubling of gas supply. For the good of the planet, let's hope we resist coal and pursue natural gas more aggressively, but that remains to be seen. Water demand, just forget climate change for a moment. Plain old population growth and industrialization, these are big consumers of water, and much of this activity is happening in parts of the planet that are already water stressed today. This is a situation at baseline with the red colors indicating water stress, 40% or more withdrawal from the region's rivers for human consumption purposes. That's the situation today. Here's configuration in 2050. What do we see? No big surprise. Even greater water stress problems in these hot, dry, lower latitudes of the planet, such as the American Southwest, the Middle East, and so on, simply because of population growth and industrialization. Climate change further exacerbates this because one of the robust conclusions from the science is that, on average, dry climatologies will become drier, wet climatologies will become wetter, punctuated by more extreme events. What you are looking at are 3 different time slices of the 21st century, ranging from, on the left-hand column, the early 21st century, the mid-21st century in the middle, and then the end of the century on the right. 3 different time slices for assuming 3 different carbon emissions scenarios, meaning 3 different choices that we make about carbon emissions. The top row you can think of as being an optimistic scenario, whereby we get very aggressive about renewables, we impose a carbon tax, we get serious about conservation. Middle row is a middle-of-the-road, moderate assumption. And then the bottom row is business as usual, burn all the coal we can get our hands on. There are a couple of conclusions I want you to take. The first is that global warming is neither truly global nor always warming. Some parts of the world stubbornly refuse to warm up, no matter how hot we take it. For example, this bullseye over the North Atlantic. It's very uneven, but it's not chaotically so. Look at the geographic pattern of the warming. It's not random from one image to the next. There are some very consistent geographic patterns that emerge and re-emerge, which brings me to the second point to be taken from these maps. And that is, well, and actually there's a third point, which is that the choices we make as a society really do have an impact on the outcome. The impacts of today's choices are really felt 80 years from now. And as a society, we're not particularly well set up to deal with 80 and 100-year problems. Our democracies work on 2 to 4 years. Our businesses work on quarterly cycles. Our daily lives, let's face it, we're worried about putting food on the table and getting to work. But back to the geographic pattern, what's the one place on Earth where this effect is amplified and felt more than any place? In the far north. And the reason for this, there's a number of feedback loops that operate there. The most important of which is a reduction in ice and snow, which reduces the reflectivity of the Earth's surface, so more sunlight coming in is absorbed. And already we're seeing some wacky stuff. From April of 2006, a remarkable story. That man on the left, his name is James Martell. He's a big game hunter, business owner from Idaho. He had permission to shoot a polar bear, and only a polar bear, in the Canadian Arctic. So his guides went and found him one, he shot it, they ran up all excited. But their excitement changed because what was laying bleeding in the snow didn't look quite right. It had dark eyes like a panda. It had a hump on its back. It had long black claws. In fact, it had many physical attributes of North American grizzly bear. Canadian wildlife biologists seized the body, took samples, did the DNA testing. Sure enough, what you're looking at is the first ever documented incidents of a polar bear, grizzly bear hybridization seen in the wild. Last year, in April 2010, a second one was shot. This time, it was the offspring of one of those. So these are not sterile, they're reproducing. Evidence of climate change? Maybe, maybe not. I'm a physical scientist. I will not take two isolated events and tell you statistically, yes, it is. I don't know. I have no idea. But what I do trust are studies like, seminal studies like these, particularly this paper in Nature in 2003, which conducted meta-statistical analyses of hundreds and hundreds of biological studies over time in the published literature, and showed that with high statistical confidence that on average, the world's plants and animal species are migrating northward at a rate of about 6 kilometers per decade. Phenological cycles, which are the annual rhythm of bud bursts, caterpillars hatching, birds flying, babies being born, and so forth, that has advanced forward on average by 2.3 days per decade. May not sound like much, but imagine your birthday coming earlier each year, 10 hours earlier than the year before. These are very, very fast changes. And those are just the averages. Some are moving faster, some are moving slower, and so on. In my travels around the north, this was a recurring theme. Oh, we have animals up here we never used to see. Not all of these migrant creatures are warm and cuddly. It's also introducing big problems like the mountain pine beetle, a horrible pest which is destroying the timber industry of Western Canada, British Columbia. About half of BC's forests are now infested with this. And the pine beetle has always been around, but it's traditionally been kept in check by winter kill. Cold winters keep this insect in check. But one of the hallmarks of northern climate change is that it is primarily a wintertime phenomenon, not a summertime phenomenon. So most of those warming that I showed you is actually occurring not year-round, which is what those maps showed, because it's been averaged out, but it's especially prevalent in the winter. So what we're seeing is a lifting, an easing of the single greatest restriction or determinant or limiting factor of biological life in these northern latitudes. The most famous observed evidence of northern climate change is this incredible, it's bumpy, but decline in the summertime minimum extent of sea ice in the Arctic Ocean. It's a polar view of the Arctic. The Arctic is an ocean surrounded by land, unlike the South Pole, which is a continent surrounded by ocean. That's why the South Pole will never warm up. It's a continent buried under 2 miles of glacier ice. Temperatures will never get above freezing on that ice sheet. If they do, God help us all, because the planet is a scorched rock. But the Arctic is an ocean covered by a meter or two of just ephemeral transient ice, low enough altitude to elevation to melt freely, and it does. And each summer it melts back, and 2007 was the record year, but the last 4 years have been the 4 lowest extents in history, including last September in 2010, both the Northwest Passage, which is a collection of passages through the Canadian archipelago, and a northern sea route over Russia. Both passages were briefly free of ice for the first time in history. This, of course, gives rise to one of the most breathlessly touted so-called benefits of global warming in this region, which is new shipping lanes. And this photo, which I took at Churchill, Manitoba, shows Canadian grain being loaded up in the port of Churchill en route to Europe. So certainly, the possibility of a geographically shorter shipping route through either the Northwest Passage or the Northern Sea Route holds great appeal. So these are actual shipping tracks showing the activity in the Arctic Ocean during the winter, in this case of 2004. Here's what it looks like in the summer. Take a look at the geographic pattern of this. This is localized activity taking place within the Arctic itself. This is not shortcut traffic. This is activity that portends future human presence and activity and exploitation of this region itself. So in addition to the big container ships, what we're more likely to see are ships like this one, like this tugboat in the Hay River up in the Northwest Territories, which has a brief window of frenetic activity during the summer. Why? Because shipping is the cheapest form of transport by far. And in such a remote place, operating on such thin profit margins and difficult conditions, that makes a huge difference in terms of accessibility. The situation is different on land. This is what's called a permafrost landscape. Permafrost is permanently frozen ground. If you were to dig into this, you can stick it at about 8 inches, and then it's like hitting concrete. You dig it away, it's soil, but it's frozen soil, frozen as hard as concrete. And in fact, it's very safe to build on this as long as you're careful to design your structure so that you don't heat the ground. If you heat the ground, because you've been sloppy, you haven't insulated, the soil thaws out, it reverts to its inherent geological structure, which is often just sediment, mud, and it begins to subside and collapse and your foundations crack. Things happen like this. This was a perfectly fine apartment building, people were living in it, and then one morning some cracks showed up. 3 days later, the entire building collapsed in a pile of rubble. This is the classic destabilization of permafrost thawing, which causes the land to settle and subside. Another threat to inland infrastructure and human access on land is a shortening in the season of so-called winter roads. Winter roads are temporary roads built each winter when the ground freezes hard enough so that you can drive on it with trucks and whatever and not damage the tundra and drive over bogs and lakes and swamps, because this is a very wet landscape. In fact, this is the only economically viable way that many of these landscapes can be accessed at all. Unlike biological life, which springs to action in the summertime, human activity in the Arctic springs to life in the wintertime. When the snow comes, the ground freezes, and a web of these temporary roads springs up all over the place, and convoys of trucks and bringing in exploration gear, you name it. Remember, climate change, it's most pronounced in winter. If you don't have really cold winters, the depth of thickness declines and it becomes harder and harder to sustain these types of roads. What you're looking at are maps for each month of the year, because it's seasonal, of the change in human access to the north between now and 2050. So what you should see are green tones in the central Arctic basin. This is where access to lightly reinforced light icebreakers will increase between now and 2050. The white areas are totally inaccessible. On land, the red areas show where the climatic suitability for winter roads will fall below the threshold to sustain winter road activity by 2050. So red colors on land, green colors in the ocean. Rising access by sea, falling access by land. Nobody seems to grasp this. Everybody thinks, oh, the permafrost is thawing, yay, we can go in and get the resources. It's actually the exact opposite. Less access on land, but increasing access by sea. And that speaks very hugely for the importance of resource production for this area. For this is a offshore terminal off the Siberian coast. You can see the tanker waiting for the sea ice to clear so we can go in and load up. And why is this so important? Well, because the Arctic is thought to hold some of the largest undiscovered reserves of petroleum on Earth, the last remaining undiscovered ones. For this recent series of assessments by the US Geological Survey suggests that up to 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of its undiscovered gas may lie in the Arctic, mostly offshore and in less than 500 meters of water. These are huge numbers for a place that covers just 4% of the globe. Will there be conflict and war over these resources in the future? I mean, perhaps, who knows? I can't predict. But all signs at present are no. And things, despite this hype, things are proceeding in a rather orderly way. And the reason for that, especially, is because there's this very widely respected and followed piece of international law called UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which governs all the world's oceans and in fact provides for every country to have a 200 nautical mile zone of exclusive use called an EEZ off its shore. Article 76 of UNCLOS allows nations to petition for an extension to their offshore EEZ. And this is what, there are 5 Arctic powers that have frontage on the Arctic Ocean: the United States, Canada, Norway, Greenland, again part of Denmark, and Russia. And all 5 of these countries are proceeding with the scientific mapping that's required to petition to gain this extended sovereignty offshore. And a country has to demonstrate that the desired seafloor is a geological extension of the continental shelf of that country. This is an overlay of the potential oil and gas deposits from the USGS. You can see they're quite extensive. This is the minimum and maximum plausible sovereignty extensions under Article 76. And I don't have time to get into the colors, but what you should see is lots of colors all over the Arctic basin. That's because the Arctic Ocean is so shallow, the bathymetry, so the potential for long extensions is very high. You should also see a lot of green color. That's the Russian potential claim. You can see it spans very large areas of the Arctic Ocean and large overlap with these petroleum deposits. But you don't need to invoke oil derricks and gas derricks in the Arctic Ocean to know that this is going to be an important place for the world's energy future, at least for the next few next 20 or 30 years. And why? Because this is the world provider of natural gas today. Russia is the world's juggernaut when it comes to natural gas. And when you guys hear in the news, oh, the Russians are going to turn off the gas and they're threatening Europe and the Ukraine and this and that gas is coming from West Siberia, which is just below this red circle. That's where 85% of Russian oil and gas comes from, is that spot. And development, those deposits are starting to play out, and development on land is beginning to drift north to that place I've circled. That's the Yamal Peninsula. Enormous amounts of gas there on land, and development is just now beginning. The first pipelines were laid last year. So even before we see a proliferation of anything in the Arctic Ocean proper, this place is going to be the world leader with natural gas. And in a way, that's a good thing because it's a lot cleaner than coal. Here's a view of the northern rim, as I call it, from the North American side. Again, you can see the coastlines of Canada, the oil and gas overlays, the potential likely and maximum potential UNCLOS Article 76 claims. But here too, in North America, you don't need to dream up hydrocarbon in the Arctic Ocean to know where the energy is going to be coming from in the near future. See that black blob there in northern Alberta? Those are the tar sands, or oil sands. The tar sands are where oil has seeped into the ground. And where it comes near the surface, not all of it is near the surface, but where it does come near the surface, the way you get this is you strip mine it. It's oil soaked into sandstone. You strip mine it off the surface, you put it in big giant trucks, you crush it, you boil it in a witch's brew of caustic soda and steam, you churn it into a slurry, you strip out sulfur, it's very low-grade hydrocarbon, you strip out the sulfur and you stack it up in those yellow pyramids because they don't know what to do with it. Then you enrich it with hydrogen from, of all things, natural gas. It gets piped in, the high-quality fossil fuel, to enrich it to a sufficient grade to be used as a high-quality transportation fuel. Hence, it takes 3 barrels of water to make 1 barrel of this stuff. Uses way more BTUs to go into it than you actually get in a barrel when it comes out. Pumps out all kinds of CO2, but you get a liquid transportation fuel. It's very lucrative. It only costs well under $50 a barrel to produce. The estimated reserves of petroleum in these deposits is 175 billion barrels. Now, this is unconventional oil. This is the world-proved reserves of conventional oil. So I know it's apples to oranges, but that number, if true, gives Canada the second largest petroleum endowment in the world after Saudi Arabia. And based on lease sales of these tar sands, which are proceeding at a frantic rate, production is expected to go up from 1.3 million barrels of synthetic oil a day produced from these today, up to 6 million by the year 2040. That number, if it comes to pass, will be 10 times the amount of oil flowing from north to south through the Alaska pipeline on the North Slope. It's a huge number. One of the key reasons to expect that to continue is the North American Free Trade Agreement. This is where globalization comes in. That liberalization specifically requires that petroleum that be allowed to pass through Canada, United States, and Mexico unencumbered by tariff. If the globalized model, business model, is the model moving forward, the argument is that these NORC countries are already they're already doing that, and they're extremely well positioned to lead in that way, or certainly set up to operate in that kind of a future. But it takes more than resources and globalization to grow populations and civilizations. It also takes people. And what do the population models tell us about these countries as compared to others of the world? Well, here's an assortment of countries and their expected population growth between now and 2050. How do the NORCs fare? Well, surprisingly well, with the exception of Russia, which is backsliding due to public health, but also a xenophobia towards immigration. We find that the NORCs are either holding their own with stable populations or growing. In fact, Canada is projected to grow over 30% between now and 2050. That's on par with India. Why is Canada going so gangbusters? Well, the biggest reason is Canada has done an amazing job of recruiting skilled immigrant workers from all around the world. And I like to illustrate with this photo from the Toronto Star. These are 2 National Hockey League commentators preparing to call out a game of the Toronto Maple Leafs in Punjabi, now poised to become Canada's 4th most spoken language. And this is important because it plays back to the other big demographic trend, aging. Remember this? Aging. Hard to believe now when immigration is so contentious, but looking into the decades ahead, those countries that learn how to welcome skilled immigrants will fare best. Simple as that. But this is a southern city phenomenon for the most part. What about the far Arctic, returning back to the hinterland? Well, there, Canada is also enjoying resurgent population growth of its domestic aboriginals, in this case, the Inuit. The demographics of the Inuit in Canada resemble that of Palestine. half the population is under the age of 19. They're having twice as many babies as the Canadians as a whole. Why is this happening in Canada and not in, say, Russia? The reason is a remarkable story. A remarkable story now wrapping up in North America of an incredible resurgence of power and political autonomy to northern peoples in North America. This is specific to North America and Greenland. And I call this map, what I'm going to show you, is the geography of Aboriginal power. And what you're looking at, the dark tones are places under some form of Aboriginal control in varying degrees. They might own the land or have joint management or whatever. And what you see are some fly specks and some bigger things in the American Southwest. These are the traditional reservations. This is the picture in the New North. This is what Aboriginal power looks like in North America today. And it began in 1971 with the passage of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and inspired a wave of settlements of ancestral land claims across Canada. With this return of political power has come hope in many ways, because now these are codified in legal binding agreements. In fact, they're enshrined in the Canadian Constitution. The people living there have skin in the game when it comes to resource extraction. They share in these revenues. And as a result, as you might imagine, many of these groups are now pro-development. They're very concerned about traditional ways and hunting, and they want it in a sustainable way. They're very concerned about protection of the environment as well, but they are also pro-development. This is not the case in Europe. It's not the case in Russia, where policies of central governments towards indigenous people, there are policies, and it's not that they don't care about their people, but they tend to focus on preservation of ways of life and historical subsistence above all else. And that's noble, and it sounds great at first, but if you think about it, it's somewhat patronizing. And it advocates preserving historical practice into bits of living folklore. That's not the case in North America. So, just to summarize, at the beginning I introduced these global pressures worldwide of rising urbanization in cities, aging, rising wealth in China. The new urban consumer will buy more, and through these global supply webs, need more resources from the earth as a whole. In the north, we see a different set of actors. Milder winters, rising biomass, productivity, along with species extinctions, I will add. The polar species are in trouble. Relative water wealth compared to these other parts of the world, rising access by ocean, but not land, development, globalized economies, favorable, peaceful borders, favorable demographics to varying degrees around the New North, which is what I term this rising of a region that's not going to take over the world or anything, and people aren't all going to up sticks and move there, but it's coming on the radar. It's a place, a coherent region of growing notice and significance to the world.
Do you think, given the push and the pull factors you've described, people will actually want to move and live and set up home and set up new lives in the New North?
In its northernmost parts, no, absolutely not. I envision the far north, the Arctic, becoming more like Nevada, a place that's still empty and desolate, but dotted with little gleaming one-industry towns, which are much more prosperous than the villages they replace. Where they will move are these big southern capital cities, which consistently rate among the most livable cities on Earth. Winters are not as bad as they used to be in these places. Favorable immigration policy, and furthermore, their economies are fueled by their remote resource hinterlands. Look at Moscow. The money coming through Moscow derives ultimately from West Siberia, but the people are moving to Moscow.
On a number of visits I've made to some of these remote communities, there are social problems. There are, although large numbers of kids, a lot of older, teenage, young adulthood, they actually move out. I mean, I'm wondering how you square, if you like, the difficulties of living in some of these more distant places with this landscape that you describe.
I actually foresee a depopulation of the remote north. First of all, there's all kinds of problems even in Nunavut and Canada with alcoholism, suicide, drug abuse, you name it. The young kids don't want a life living on the land hunting. They want to move into town and have and internet, and a lot of them want to move south altogether. So you combine that with the lack of access, it's going to get more and more difficult to even supply and reach these places on land. I foresee abandonment and depopulation of the far north in favor of these southern cities. But the exploitation, to the extent that it happens, will happen from maritime economies and ships along the coast.